So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining on Friday and kind of like a short notice. Today, my name is Ophir Gutelson from UnXeptable, and today I'm hosting Amy Spitalnick. Hi, Amy.
Thanks for having me.
I would just make a short intro about Amy because I actually met Amy just about a year ago, just before Netanyahu's visit to New York and San Francisco, and when the judicial overhaul was just at its peak. And Amy was one of the few brave Jewish leaders of the community to speak up and not sitting on the fence. So thank you, Amy, for that. Amy Amy is the CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. Previously led the organization that successfully sued the neo-Nazis who attacked Charlottesville, and recently published a report about the interconnection of anti-Semitism and democracy. Amy, we are just about getting 100 people here, so we can start really on time, almost. I wanted to ask you really just telling your story, like how did you end up fighting neo-Nazis, and how did you end up running the Jewish, the JCPA?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Ophir, for having me. It's great to see you virtually. I'll see you in person next week in the Bay Area, and hopefully some other folks on this call, where I'm excited to be speaking in Los Altos Hills on Thursday, and we'll make sure to share that information. And it's just particularly meaningful to be with all of you this week. It has been a hard and painful and challenging week for all of us. And so I'm really grateful to get to be in this community with so many people, I think, share our values and our commitment to the issues that we're going to be talking about, to the Jewish community, to Israel's future, to the hostages, and to a peaceful future here. Look, if you had told me probably 5-6 years ago that I would be leading a national Jewish organization right now, I might have thought you were crazy. I was working in New York politics and government, which is where I spent a lot of my time and career. I spent time in City Hall working for the mayor. I spent time in the New York Attorney General's office during the beginning of the Trump administration, when state attorneys general really were on the front lines of countering the most extremist policies coming out of Washington, fighting hate, protecting immigrants, and environmental rollbacks, and the Muslim ban, and hate crimes, and so much else that was really at stake and continues to be at stake in many ways. While the Jewish community, while Israel has always been inherent to my own identity, I spent a year at Hebrew University. Like so many American Jews, I was my Hillel president in college at Tufts University. I started my career at J Street as they were getting off the ground as their first press secretary. But I think coming back to the sort of Jewish communal landscape is not something I necessarily had on my bingo card, but the world really evolved in a way that made this work so much more urgent, and really, I think, provides an opportunity to do something in this space that feels existential right now. And so when I was working in the New York Attorney General's office, I met some of the fantastic lawyers who had the idea to bring this lawsuit against the neo-Nazis and white supremacists responsible for the violence in Charlottesville. I think many of us remember that visceral feeling from 7 years ago, watching these Nazis with torches descending on the University of Virginia in downtown Charlottesville, chanting, "Jews will not replace us," in blood and soil, the most heinous, bigoted, anti-Semitic, racist ideas that are at the core of, frankly, what the Nazis believed, what white supremacists have tried to advance in this country for generations. And for me, that really ripped off the Band-Aid of the crisis of hate and extremism that we're facing here, how deeply interconnected anti-Semitism is with other forms of hate. When we saw the Jewish community, the Black community, and others being targeted in Charlottesville, Heather Heyer was murdered, and many others grievously injured. And so when the opportunity to get to work with those injured in the violence and our brilliant attorneys came up leading this organization, Integrity First for America, it was impossible to say no. I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. And I think similarly to how I feel about sort of leading a Jewish communal organization now, if you told me we would need to sue Nazis, at this point of time, I might have thought that was crazy. I think in some ways I'm grateful my grandparents aren't here to have seen what happened in Charlottesville and Pittsburgh and in so many of these other communities in recent years. And at the same time, holding these extremists accountable, making clear it has no place here, feels precisely where we should be focusing our efforts. And so I was fortunate to get to lead this organization and work closely with our incredible plaintiffs who were all people injured in the violence, work closely with others in the Charlottesville community and with our incredible legal team. And we ultimately went to trial in October and November of 2021 and resulted in a multi-million-dollar verdict that has effectively bankrupted and dismantled a number of these key neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups and leaders, people like Richard Spencer, the National Socialist Movement, and others. And in the course of that work, I also got to know a lot of the Jewish communal landscape very well again. Understandably so, the Jewish community was particularly interested in the work we were doing. We partnered closely with a number of Jewish communal organizations. And so JCPA, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, is this 80-year-old organization that was founded in 1944, the height of World War II and the end of the Holocaust, recognizing that Jewish safety here in the United States was deeply connected to the rights and safety of all communities in our democracy. And we needed to be building bridges across communities in order to advance our safety, to counter anti-Semitism, to protect our community and so many others. And 80 years later, I think that mission and that message has never been more urgent. And so when JCPA went through a restructuring in order to bring it into the moment that we're in and was looking for their new CEO, it really felt like an opportunity to take this legacy organization and help bring it into the moment that we're in, help tell that story of why Jewish safety is so deeply connected to building inclusive, multiracial, multi-faith democracy here in the United States. And that at a time, particularly right now, after October 7th, where we're feeling so much pain and anguish and grief, and our instincts are to put up walls, we need to resist those instincts in many ways and continue building coalitions and bridges across communities wherever possible, because ultimately our safety and our futures are so deeply intertwined. And that's at the core of the work that we're doing, helping people understand why the fight against anti-Semitism is inherent to their own safety and to our democracy, and mobilizing the Jewish community and our partners to fight for our democracy and the rights and safety of all communities. I think you're muted. You might be muted. I can't hear you.
My dog was bark.
Yeah.
When you talked about October 7th, it just and the mission. I mean, like probably as someone who defined yourself as you said, like more on the progressive side, liberal side. I mean, like you probably was shocked as well from like many of us from the reaction and tension in our own camp. And on the same time, you are really one of the only voices that talking about we need to rebuild those bridges. We need to really talk about how our safety is connected to other organizations, other minority safety. How do you find this? How did you react when you saw the first campuses violent, or what is being defined as anti-Semitism from the left?
Yeah. Well, look, I think first and foremost, I started this job in September. And so a month into this job, much like every American Jew, I think that watching what happened on October 7th and the aftermath, it's something that I probably never could have imagined. And it was among the most painful things I've seen in my lifetime. And I grew up in New York during 9/11. I have been working on some of these really challenging and horrific issues. And I, for most of my career, and yet October 7th, grabbed all of our hearts, but I think impacted me personally in a way that was almost like surprising in certain ways. Just the layers of grief that I think all of us 11 months in are still grappling with. And it's important to acknowledge that because we're still in trauma in this moment as a community. The hostages remain, the war is ongoing, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is ongoing, right? So all of us who care about Israel, who care about the region, the Israelis and the Palestinians, we're still in trauma. We need to acknowledge that as a starting point. I think it's important to understand that there have been a lot of stories told about what happened after October 7th in the progressive community, in lefty spaces, in American politics. And some of them are true, and some of them are a lot more complex than the loudest voices might like us to believe. And so for every heartbreaking or painful comment we saw from someone from, the far left Democratic Socialist rally in Times Square that first weekend here in New York or in other communities around the country, there were also incredible civil rights leaders, progressive leaders, labor leaders, and others who reached out, who spoke out, who made clear that what happened on October 7th was unacceptable. I think of the Black civil rights leader who called me on October 8th to see how I was doing and to check in on what she could do. I think of people like Reverend William Barber, who wrote a beautiful op-ed, I think in The Nation, or maybe The Guardian, one of the two, sort of unequivocally condemning what happened on October 7th, even if he had fundamental disagreements with the Netanyahu government and the occupation, right? And there were leaders like that who I think were not actually aligned with the narrative some of us have been told, that no one showed up for us. At the same time, there were absolutely many lefty or progressive spaces where, rather than acknowledging what happened, the horrors of October 7th, the murders, the sexual violence, the kidnapping, they immediately defaulted to justification or both sides-isms or other deeply painful dynamics that broke my heart, and I know broke many other sort of liberal and progressive American Jews' hearts. And we need to understand what that line is, right? What that gradient is. And most importantly, I think the work that we've been doing has been focused on how do we help people actually understand what it means to show up as an ally for the Jewish community in a moment like that. We're not asking people to put an Israeli flag on their front door or on their social media profile or put out a statement unequivocally supporting the actions of the Israeli government or the IDF. What we're asking people to do is, in hoping for peace and hoping for this war to ultimately end, make sure that you're starting from a place that acknowledges both Israeli and Palestinian humanity, that calls for the release of the hostages, that acknowledges the horrors of October 7th, and that also acknowledges the humanity and dignity of the Palestinian people and their right to self-determination and the need to end this war in a way that secures a peaceful future for both people. And so some of the work that we can do as a community is simply helping people to understand what it means to even show up as an ally to us in this moment, the same way that we ask them to help us show up for them in their moments of need, in their moments of crisis. And it's being explicit, it's being clear about what certain rhetoric and certain language means. It's having the hard conversations about the terms and the shouting and the protests that have dominated so much of the public debate around this. I think the average person showing up for some of these protests on college campuses are doing so just because they want to support the Palestinian people. But the ways in which some of these protests have crossed the line into real harm, into anti-Semitic language and other language that is deeply painful and harmful to Jews and Israelis, is important to help people understand. It's important to help people understand what I mean when I talk about the term Zionist, which might be different than their own definition of it. And so there's a lot of work that we need to do to actually have these hard conversations and help people understand what it means to show up for us as an ally and how they can engage on these issues in a way that doesn't do harm. And that requires us leaning into these conversations, having the hard conversations, not walking away from the table. There are always going to be red lines. There are always going to be those groups and those leaders who have made clear they don't care about Jewish safety or Israeli humanity or Israel's fundamental right to exist. And it's important to be clear about where those red lines are in your relationships. But for the vast majority of people in many of these spaces, there's an opportunity to actually lean into these conversations in a way that helps engage them and builds that understanding so that we're even starting from a place where we're speaking the same language, which so many of us are not right now.
When I was walking into the encampments of Stanford and Berkeley and others, I mean, like, it was kind of like clear that there is a lot of ignorance in those groups, and people were kind of like talking what those external leaders, I would say, to those encampments came and shout. one of the things that I saw that you have done, I mean, like, is reaching out to people who, on the first hand side, like AOC and others, are kind of like, oh, they're probably on the lefty side, and you lean in and make a discussion with them and try to and get them to join you. Do you have any tips, like how to lean in and talk to people that you pretty sure they are against you, like by definition?
Yeah. So, a couple months ago, I was invited by Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, to speak to a webinar of her social media followers. And she, as I'm sure many folks know, has a lot of social media followers, all largely on the progressive side of the political spectrum. And so it was really a huge opportunity to talk to an audience who might not typically talk to someone like me, who might not have the opportunity to talk about anti-Semitism and our democracy through a progressive Zionist or liberal Zionist lens. And I was really appreciative of the Congresswoman for the invitation and for the opportunity to talk to people who otherwise might not otherwise get to do so. And the framework for our conversation, and I think this is both because this framework is accurate and rooted in reality, but also it's actually resonant in engaging people in the conversation around anti-Semitism, is about the deep interconnection of anti-Semitism and democracy. So we sort of alluded to some of this earlier, and I can unpack it more throughout our conversation. But we've seen in recent years how anti-Semitism has really fueled and animated broader hate and anti-democratic extremism. Anti-Semitism, of course, operates like so many forms of hate. It's a form of prejudice that targets us as Jews because of who we are, what we look like, how we pray, how we observe our identity. But what's unique about anti-Semitism is that it also operates as this insidious, pernicious conspiracy theory rooted in lies and tropes about Jewish control and power. And we hear it in a variety of ways, right? We talked about the Jews will not replace us chants in Charlottesville. That's at the core of that is this anti-Semitic, white supremacist, xenophobic conspiracy theory that Jews are orchestrating the replacement of the white race in the United States through immigration and through stealing the election, through efforts to meddle with the birth rate through abortion, through support for the LGBTQ community. And as we've seen in that cycle of violence from Charlottesville to Pittsburgh and Tree of Life, which was the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in US history, Poway attack in California, the El Paso attack, which targeted the Latino and immigrant community in Texas, the Buffalo attack that targeted the Black community in New York, all of these attacks were fueled by that very same conspiracy theory, the Great Replacement, which is rooted in these anti-Semitic lies and targets, ultimately, as we saw through the cycle of hate, not just Jews, but so many other communities, and fundamentally our democratic norms and values and rule of law. And so too have we seen similar anti-Semitic tropes, right, about George Soros stealing the election, and a lot of the election denialism that we saw on January 6th, whether it is conspiracy theories and tropes related to Zionist control and power of our government, of our banks, of our institutions, right? Ultimately, the goal of these anti-Semitic lies is to sow distrust in our institutions, in our government, and tear communities apart in a way that fuels hate and extremism that doesn't just make Jews unsafe, but makes each and every community unsafe and ultimately undercuts our democracy. And so too, as our democracy erodes, as our democratic norms fall apart in this country, it allows anti-Semitism to further fester because people are looking for someone to blame for the bad things that are happening. And so we're in this constant feedback loop in which anti-Semitism is used to undermine our democracy. And as democratic norms and values are under assault here in America, it makes it less safe for Jews and ultimately everyone. And so it's that framework, and this is at the core of this report that I published that I'm sure we can share out with folks afterwards. It's on the JCPA website. It's called Anti-Semitism X by Democracy. And it's at the core of this report that we published over the summer, and that really unpacks this interconnection and makes recommendations for how we can actually talk about this in a way that engages people. And the good news is that it's not just true that we know anti-Semitism and democracy are deeply connected. The facts tell us this, and the data tells us this. All of the research tells us that people who believe in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are disproportionately likely to believe in political violence. And so too is anti-Semitism the best predictor of belief in conspiracy theories. And you can go on and on. But actually, the message research tells us the most effective way to engage people, including the youngest Americans, 18 to 34-year-olds, who are the youngest you can actually test as part of some of this. This is actually the most effective way to help them understand why they need to care about anti-Semitism, why they have a stake in the fight against anti-Semitism, how it impacts them and their safety and rights in our democracy. And so it's not only accurate, it's not only the right thing to do, it's actually most effective in engaging people. And so I think, as part of my conversations with the Congresswoman's office, with Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez's office, they read this report and we really used it as the framework for this conversation that I think was remarkable in many ways, not because we were saying anything groundbreaking, but because we really leaned into the hard conversations. And we started from a place of saying, we're not going to agree on everything, right? Some of the language, some of the policies she takes on Israel especially are not my own. And also she was willing to sit down with someone like me who she disagreed with and me with her, and my colleague Stacey Burdett as well, who joined. And we had the hard conversation where we talked about, yes, the white supremacist anti-Semitism in Charlottesville and Pittsburgh and Poway, El Paso and Buffalo, and also very explicitly how anti-Semitism is manifesting in progressive spaces in the Israel conversation. And AOC said in that conversation, it's a threat to progressive values. It's a threat to peace for the region. It's a threat to all of us when we allow anti-Semitism to creep into the conversations on Israel. She called out the next day the horrific anti-Semitic protest outside the Nova Memorial in New York City that happened in June. And the following, later in the week, we saw a horrific attack on the director of the Brooklyn Museum that was rooted in a lot of anti-Semitic ideas as well. And so too did AOC's leadership calling out anti-Semitism, I think, create permission structure for other progressive politicians to call this out. And so we're never going to agree on everything, and that's okay. But having the most, I think, prominent progressive politician in America right now, right, speak out so clearly about the fact that there is, in fact, anti-Semitism that does exist in progressive spaces, particularly as it relates to Israel, and that we all have an obligation to do something about it, and that doing so doesn't take away from the fight for progressive values or for the fight for peace. In fact, it only enhances that fight. That's enormously powerful, and I'm grateful to her for using that voice. I'm particularly grateful because some of you might have seen that the Democratic Socialists decided to specifically unendorse her after this webinar, citing her webinar with us, which to me tells me everything you need to know about, I think, her clarity in calling this out, and frankly, the lack of moral clarity by the DSA.
And just yesterday, I mean, like we saw an example coming from the left side. I mean, like attacking the CNN correspondent.
Anna Bash, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, just and that's an example for why someone is attacking someone else just because they are Jew. From the left, I mean, even though they in theory they think that they are working for the right cause, which is again getting us on a piece, but most of them are just ignorance about that. And at the same time, as that's happening, we saw President Trump, former President Trump, talking to the RJC and keeping his rhetoric about what Jews should think and how they should think and how Israel will survive or not survive by their vote. As someone who is part of this organization that is fighting for democracy, I mean, like this feels like erosion of democracy when you hear a candidate speaking like that. And I mean, how do you answer to those who think this is a partisan issue?
Yeah.
I mean, anti-Semitism and democracy is a partisan issue.
Yeah. Well, look, all of the examples you described, right? Just what happened in the last 24 hours alone. None of it is good for the Jews. None of it is good for Israel. None of it is good for those of us who believe in democracy or peace or a two-state solution or any of the future that I think most of us want to see here. It's ultimately the weaponization of Jews, of anti-Semitism, of Israel to advance political goals, and that doesn't make any of us safer. And so whether it is specifically targeting Jewish journalists or authors or artists just because they're Jewish, right? If you were to target all journalists at their book talks, calling them out for not doing enough to cover the conflict or the humanitarian crisis in Gaza or the horrific situation that the Palestinians in Gaza are living in, then that would be understandable. You should criticize Israeli policy. You should critique journalist coverage when it's not fair or inaccurate. But when it's only Jewish journalists or authors or artists or leaders who are being targeted and non-Jews are not, who effectively have the same positions, that's anti-Semitism. And we need to be clear about this. It's the same thing that we saw, for example, with Josh Shapiro, who had the very similar Israel policies to the vast majority of candidates for the vice presidential nomination. But it was only him, the Jewish candidate, that was labeled Genocide Josh, and that was disproportionately targeted. And we can critique his policies. We should disagree with him or any candidate or elected official when we disagree with their policies. We should call that out. But when it's Jews who are the only ones who are being publicly targeted in a deeply personal way, in a way to sort of shout them out of the public forum or ban them from public spaces, as we saw with Dana Bash last night, as we've seen with certain Jewish authors and others, these lists intended to ban and boycott Zionist authors and artists, that is a form of anti-Semitism, and we need to be clear about that. And similarly, it can't be considered partisan to call out anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic tropes when a candidate for office, including the Republican candidate for president and the former president, is engaging in them. And just yesterday, Trump doubled down on some of the most dangerous tropes and rhetoric related to Jews that he has used over and over again. He again labeled Jews who don't support him politically as crazy, saying we need to have our heads checked. And the goal there is really to divide Jews into good and bad camps, to say there are the good Jews who support Trump and the Republicans, and then there are the 70 to 80% of American Jews who don't, and therefore they're bad. And what that does is it normalizes attacks, it normalizes bigotry against the bad Jews. It makes it okay to attack them. Similarly, he so often plays into these dual loyalty tropes that conflate the Jewish community and the Jewish people in the diaspora and around the world, with Israel, which we know dual loyalty tropes are deeply dangerous. Obviously, we can both acknowledge the deep connection many American Jews and diaspora Jews have to Israel without playing into dual loyalty tropes that directly conflate the state of Israel and the Jewish people, and the danger of doing that, as he so often has done. And similarly, he has just fundamentally engaged in lies and other misleading comments about the president and the vice president's policies on Israel and anti-Semitism, and some of it has become deeply personal, including, calling Doug Emhoff, the second gentleman, a crappy Jew, or leaning into some of these most bigoted tropes related to the vice president. We need to call that out, and particularly the ways in which it's manifesting in the campaigns right now in a way that it can't be partisan to do so. We need to recognize that all this does is normalize anti-Semitism, treat Jews and Israel as political footballs, and it makes none of us safer. And I think wherever it's coming from, whether it's anti-Semitism from the Republican presidential candidate or from lefty activists, we need to be calling it out wherever it rears its ugly head.
And in that case, one of the things that is we are being asked a lot as Israeli Americans is policies that Israeli government is referring to, or again, many of us are really going and asking for signing the deal and the ceasefire and the returning of the hostages. I mean, when these statements are being said, are you feeling that people should be reflecting in a way that, am I saying it as an Israeli or a Jewish person? And how will I feel if I'm being attacked? If I'm attacked as an Israeli, it means that it's anti-Semite? Or is it, or only when I'm being attacked as a Jew, it's anti-Semite?
Yeah. Look, it gets very messy, right? This is why it's so important to help people actually understand what some of these terms mean. I think the term Zionist, for example, is the right lens to understand this. For me, Zionism means simply the belief that there should be a Jewish homeland somewhere in this region where we have deep historical connections. And for me, it goes hand in hand with the belief that there needs to be a Palestinian state side by side, a future in which Israelis and Palestinians can live in peace and security, two states for two people, and ultimately, and I would say like a democratic Israel, a Jewish and democratic Israel. For me, that's Zionism. And that's always been my Zionism. But the term means something different you know, whoever you ask. In the public conversation, it's become so muddled, so mucky. And so if you ask the average college student who might be showing up at these encampments or these protests, you know, saying we shouldn't have Zionists on campus, I'm not sure they even know what that means, because at the end of the day, the vast majority of American Jews, 80 to 90% of American Jews, have a relationship with Israel, believe that Israel should exist, even if we fundamentally disagree with the Netanyahu government or with actions taken by the IDF as part of this war. And we also fundamentally believe in Palestinian humanity and dignity and self-determination. And so when we're saying banning and boycotting Zionists from campuses, or, you know, author lists or artist lists or any of these other things we've seen, it's effectively saying ban and boycott 80 to 90% of American Jews or Israeli Americans or others who hold these positions. And we need to help people understand that. We need to help people understand what this term means, the same way that, you know, when we hear the term intifada, for me, like one of my most formative moments in my relationship with Israel was the second intifada. I like came of age in my relationship with Israel during a time when buses and pizza parlors and other places were being blown up. Hebrew University, where I went, had the cafeteria bombed during the second intifada. And so I hear that term fundamentally differently than someone, you know, like a Palestinian American or Arab American who might be shouting it because they think it is a sort of a freedom term. Right. And so we need to help people understand what these terms actually mean to us as Jewish Americans or Israeli Americans or Israelis or others, because that allows us to, again, start from a place where we're even speaking the same language and can then in turn understand the harm that's being done. The same way that I know I've had many conversations with Muslim friends and Arab friends about some of the language and terms we might use, including in a post 9/11 America, where some of the language around radicalization and terrorism has been used to go after Muslim civil rights and Arab American civil rights. We need to understand the harm that some of the language and terms we might use, and inadvertently or intentionally, can have. And so it's, again, leaning into these conversations to help people do that. There are always going to be people who refuse to, or who want to cause that harm, or refuse to hear the harm that they're doing. But I think we have to find those opportunities to help people actually understand what this all means. And it's only from there that we can then begin, you know, repairing the breach that I think many of us are feeling right now.
I'm actually going to bring David Myers, who is helping us on the background on Spotlight. He has a great question, and I will sift through the chat on the meanwhile. Hold on.
Thank you,
David.
Well,
There you go. No. Oh, I put someone else on Spotlight. Hold on.
maybe him.
Go ahead, David.
Thank you, Amy. So actually, this is digging into what you were just talking about, and maybe to even sharpen a little bit. So, you know, if you look at the spectrum, you can say, well, criticizing Israel, criticizing Israeli policies, criticizing an Israel that doesn't allow for Palestinian self-determination, you know, it's fine to criticize that. On the other hand, attacking a Jewish deli is way on the anti-Semitic side. Let me ask you about the middle. Someone like Jewish Voice for Peace that actually does not believe that Zionism is legitimate. And they can say, well, that's a political view. We're not anti-Semitic. But to your point, 80 to 90% of Jews feel some sense of Zionism. How do you address that when people say, no, this is my political view? I think partition in 1947 was wrong. It was done by a bunch of old white guys in Europe, you know, who have no right to decide what happens in the global South. And yeah, you may feel an affinity, but you know, we think that was wrong. And that's, so when we say we don't want Zionists, that's a political statement, not an anti-Semitic one. How do you handle that plight?
Yeah. Well, this is a great question. And I think where a lot of, frankly, the conversation is or needs to be, because this is where it gets murky. And this is where it's hard for people to understand where that line is crossed from like real criticism or ideological beliefs related to nationalism and religious-based states or some of these other questions versus actual anti-Semitism. Of course, when Jews are targeted for the actions of the Israeli government, as you said, you know, whether it's a Jewish deli or a restaurant, my own synagogue was targeted in Brooklyn last year, right after October 7th. We know that is anti-Semitism. When Jews are being targeted for the actions of the Israeli government, that is anti-Semitism, full stop. And we need to be clear about that. Even if they support the Israeli government, we should not be targeting synagogues and homes and businesses and others in a violent or hateful way, period. The question about JVP or other anti-Zionist organizations, right? I think in theory, I don't believe that all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. I think in practice, a lot of it has been. And it's important to sort of parse that out, right? There are anti-Zionist Jews, religious and non, who just fundamentally don't believe in the idea of nationalism, who don't believe that there should be a Jewish state. And if that is fundamentally their belief, and they're not, and that's a belief that they would apply to anyone, any state, no matter if it was Jewish or another religion or ethnicity, then I don't think that that is necessarily inherently rooted in anti-Semitism. However, in a number of cases, anti-Zionism has effectively been used by some to uniquely target Israel in a way that they wouldn't target other states. And so when Israel is uniquely singled out or otherwise targeted simply because it is a Jewish state and you aren't applying the same standards to other countries and other peoples, that to me can in many cases cross the line. And it's really hard to understand that because it gets messy and murky, and there are very real conversations to have about, Israel's Jewish identity and how it's implemented and what it means and how it's used to, for me as a non-Orthodox Jew, my role in Israel, right? In addition to all of the democracy questions, what it fundamentally means to be in a Jewish state. How do you protect democracy in a Jewish state? And we need to be asking and grappling with all these questions. And also, we need to make sure that in doing so, those conversations are rooted in a lot of the questions we just asked. Are we crossing the line into targeting Israel and the Israeli people in a way that you wouldn't any other people, any other state? And that to me is where anti-Zionism can become anti-Semitism. But I think the idea that every single instance of anti-Zionism, including, Jews who just fundamentally don't believe in the idea of nationalism, is inherently anti-Semitic is not where I find myself. And also in practice, we see how a lot of the anti-Zionism that we have seen has in fact crossed that line. And so it requires, right, that's not something that fits neatly into a tweet or into like a 4-sentence or to like a 2-sentence post on social media. It requires helping people unpack that. It requires leaning into the work, right? There's a lot of conversations around how we define anti-Semitism, and no definition at the end of the day is going to allow us to do this cleanly and perfectly in all situations. It requires the conversation and the hard work.
Thank you. It's a great answer. I did hope you were going to give me the tweet length answer, but I guess that continues to elude all of us.
I'll work on it.
Okay. Ophir, do you have other questions?
Yeah. Just a second. Let me bring it back. So Amy, let's talk about democracy for a second. And we are in an election period, and a lot of the discussions that we are hearing is again, about the risk to democracy. And since we are both seeing, again, we have some experience coming from the Israeli side about what's happening when someone, in our case indicted, can take the country into a crisis. One of the fears that I hear from my friends is that once we get to the election, to the result of the election, and there will be again erosion in decision, or even about agreeing on the election results. Do you see any risk to Jews at that point of time, more than it is right now? Like, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, look, I think at the core of all of the attacks on our democracy, and these include both the ways in which the vote itself is being, weaponized, whether it is the conspiracy theories we talked about the election being stolen, or George Soros, or Jews, or cabal, or globalists seeking to steal the election, or conspiracy theories that we'll ultimately see come out in November about, who actually won, or whether the votes were real. Or I would also argue the anti-democratic policies, the dehumanizing policies that underpin a lot of this, right? None of this is happening in a silo. When we think about these election denialism, or the conspiracy theories that undergird what we saw in 2020 and January 6th and what we'll inevitably see again this year in some form, they go hand in hand with the broader assault on people's rights, right? The assault on voting rights on the national level, on the state and local levels. They go hand in hand with disinformation and foreign influence campaigns. I'm sure we'll talk about, I mean, we saw this weekend this stunning indictment from DOJ. This affidavit is worth everyone reading, how Russia deliberately targeted a variety of communities, including the Jewish community, with a right-wing disinformation campaign. And we know the role that Russia and other foreign actors, including Iran, Qatar, China, and others, are trying to play in undercutting our democracy and pitting our communities against one another. And so understanding disinformation and social media policies and all of those things is fundamental. The ways in which dehumanizing policies targeting immigrants in the Black community and the LGBTQ community are used to further fuel a lot of these conspiracy theories and otherize people in a way that, again, leads to this broader anti-democratic extremism about elections being stolen and immigrants replacing the electorate or the white race. And so book bans, curriculum bans, right? If you don't understand history, you're bound to repeat it. And we're seeing book bans, not just targeting lessons on slavery and white supremacy or the LGBTQ community, but also, of course, in some cases, creeping into Holocaust education. There was a Hechinger report earlier this year that's on the JCPA website that specifically talks about how these book and curriculum bans are creeping into Holocaust education. And so over and over again, not just the direct conspiracy theories and lies we see around the election every 4 years or on the local level more frequently, but also the dehumanizing extremist policies that underpin them. And in particular for Jews, I want to name the fact that in a year where we're talking a lot about Project 2025, we've all heard about it at this point, ultimately there is now a blueprint that is intended to totally demolish the line between church and state in the United States. It's effectively a Christian nationalist blueprint for how this country would move forward in a way that is so deeply dangerous to Jews and so many others, whether it is, again, ending the separation of church and state in a way that will, we know, end poorly for Jews, whether it's mass deportation of immigrants, whether it's gutting our education department and our civil rights infrastructure and our voting rights. None of this is going to make Jews safer or any community safer. And we know that as, again, inclusive democracy and democratic norms erode, it only creates the conditions for these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories to further flourish, just as the anti-Semitism fuels the dehumanizing policies and broader extremism. And so we find ourselves in this feedback loop in which we as Jews need to fundamentally be mobilizing for democracy right now. And that is because we know it's inherent to our safety. And that's what we're doing at JCPA. We launched earlier this summer 2 action networks focused on how we can protect our democracy and counter hate and extremism, mobilizing on issues like voting rights, countering disinformation, election integrity, countering book bans, countering anti-Semitism, of course, but particularly also helping people understand its deep connections with anti-immigrant hate, anti-Black hate, anti-LGBTQ hate, Islamophobia, and other forms of bigotry. Because if we are not helping connect the dots here, if we're not mobilizing as a community, not just for our own safety, but for all community safety and for our democracy, we know that we are so often the canary in the coal mine when it comes to what this means to our safety and to ultimately everyone's safety.
And I just posted on the chat, I saw an interesting documentary just a week ago that came out about called Bad Faith, about national Christian nationality.
You're breaking up for a second.
It's like internet connection. Can you hear now?
Oh yeah, now I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Many questions are following. I mean, this discussion about there is different definition for anti-Semitism, ADL, extending the anti-Semitism to everything that is anti-Zionist. I think you covered many of those already. So, I mean, anything to add on, like how you look on things different than the ADL, or if there isn't even a difference between those approaches?
Yeah, look, I think there's a few things to say here. First, so JCPA as an organization utilizes the IRA definition as a resource, which is what it should be, right? It is intended to be a resource. That's how it was developed by a number of the lead authors, including Ken Stern and others who've spoken frequently about this. And so JCPA adopted IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition, a number of years back as a resource. We have not been supportive of codifying it into law, which is a distinction. Of course, I think actually the White House strategy handled this brilliantly, where it points to IRA, it points to Nexus, and it uses a lot of its own language, similar to what we've been talking about here, to talk about what anti-Semitism is. And I think so often we get so bogged down in these conversations about definitions that sometimes we actually lose sight of the practical implications. And so at the end of the day, while these definitions are valuable tools and resources, and we should be using them and encouraging folks to use them in government and law and otherwise as resources, we also need to be able to address these from a practical human perspective and understand that not everything is going to neatly fit into some of these definitions, and how sometimes these definitions are used in a way that is unhelpful. And so we need to be able to apply that nuance and that lens to this while continuing to use IRA and Nexus as others as resources, as the White House suggested. And I think that's an important support. And ultimately, again, right, that White House strategy, the Biden-Harris anti-Semitism strategy, which came out a year ago, is remarkable, not just because of how it navigated this specific issue, but because it's this whole of government, whole of society approach to countering anti-Semitism that is fundamentally rooted in a lot of the ideas we're talking about here. That fighting anti-Semitism isn't just a Jewish issue, it's a democracy issue. It's an issue that requires building cross-community solidarity, and it requires a whole of government, whole of society approach. So too is the White House, working on an Islamophobia strategy and broader efforts to counter hate-fueled violence. And the recognition that that goes hand in hand with the fight against anti-Semitism is deeply important, and something that we as a community should be mobilizing around. In particular, the Countering Anti-Semitism Act, which is a bill that would effectively put real resources behind the White House strategy, is something that we are deeply supportive of. And we helped, alongside our partners at a number of Jewish organizations, bring together 61 national Jewish organizations, from the progressive groups like J Street over to AIPAC, in support of this bill. There has not been a coalition this broad and diverse in the Jewish community supporting a piece of legislation, I think, since the 90s, is what JTA reported. And so how we can mobilize around those policies over which there's broad-based consensus and would actually move forward these important strategies is a core thing we can do right now. And if you go to the JCPA website, there's a place where you could specifically write to your members of Congress in support of the Countering Anti-Semitism Act, in addition to some of the other bills we've talked about here.
So I will post it on our recording and as a link to everyone. Is part of this coalition is also spiritual leaders? Like, what do you find? What do you find? Where do you find those spiritual leaders' role in this discussion?
Yeah. Well, look, I think particularly in the last year, but certainly long before that, and I think back to the New York rally where we met, I think, in person the first time, right? The rabbis, the clergy who were there, are the voices who are so often speaking with the most moral clarity of this. I think of people like Sharon Kleinbaum and Elliot Cosgrove and Sharon Brous and Rachel Timoner and other rabbis who have been among the strongest voices in articulating not just the pain and the grief of the last year, but also the complexity of it, who have been able to speak out for Israeli democracy, speak out in all of those ways before October 7th as they did, and also post October 7th have been able to help move our community forward in a way that recognizes the pain and the grief that we're all feeling, that centers the hostages and the need for them to be returned as part of any deal, and that doesn't lose sight of Palestinian humanity and dignity and self-determination and our own moral clarity and compass that we need to have in these conversations. That, think about like Elliot Cosgrove and Rachel Timoner, who both gave beautiful sermons about the webinar I did with AOC, because they recognize the importance of leaning into those conversations. And that's important, right? Spiritual leaders can hold the complexity of this and help us navigate this in a way that few can. And that's true within the Jewish community, but it's also true in the interfaith partnerships that are at the core of our work. We're building work at JCPA that is focused not just on empowering rabbis and cantors and other Jewish leaders with how to talk about anti-Semitism through this democracy lens, but also our interfaith partners, Black pastors and imams and others who are out there in their communities each and every day, leading the fight against hate and for democracy on the local levels. And it's so important that we support them in doing so, that we lean into these conversations with them, and that we help them figure out what it means to show up as an ally for the Jewish community the same way that we need to show up for them, which is where we started this conversation. How are we actually helping these partners, these faith leaders and others, show up for us the same way that we can show up for them?
So that brings me to a question that is kind of like combined. There is a lot of organization that now post October 7 is trying to work with K-12 teachers and colleges and others to educate them about anti-Semitism. And I don't think that any of them are doing it from the lens of democracy. So the first question is like, what do the JCPA is offering on that part? And on the same time, I mean, we see a lot of heroes, Spitalnick and others, that on the same time, encampment and anti-Semitism rise left on the side, they're also supporting the replacement theory publicly, or they're talking about that. So how do you balance one side education and the other side calling out those who are fighting again for against anti-Semitism from the left, but on the same time doing it differently from the right side? So I think it's a kind of like combining, or you can take them separately.
I'll start with the second piece because it probably will lead to what we can do on the first, on the K-12 front. Look, there have been a lot of elected officials and politicians who have been very outspoken about campus anti-Semitism. And that's important because there are very legitimate concerns about campus anti-Semitism right now. And as we talked about, not every student showing up to an encampment or a protest is there because they intend to be anti-Semitic, but we know the line has been crossed in a number of places. And there needs to be systems and procedures and policies and accountability in place to protect all students, to protect Jewish students and Israeli students, to protect Palestinian and Arab students. And that also includes, by the way, fully resourcing the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Ed, which is the office tasked with investigating and holding accountable violations of students' rights on campus, including Jewish students, as well as Israeli, Palestinian, Arab, and anyone else. At the same time, some of the very elected officials who are holding these hearings or otherwise like waving the mantle or banner of combating anti-Semitism on campus have normalized or engaged in policies or conspiracy theories or rhetoric that we know directly harms Jews, whether it's the invasion and replacement rhetoric like the Great Replacement or other conspiracy theories and tropes, including some of the disloyal Jews tropes that we talked about Trump using over and over again, whether it's politicians like Elise Stefanik, who got a star turn when she questioned a number of these campus presidents last year and rightfully raised some of the concerns that many of us share about campus anti-Semitism, but out of the other side of her mouth was espousing invasion and replacement rhetoric, and also has been leading the GOP caucus, which has sought to dramatically cut funding for the Office of Civil Rights, the very office, again, tasked with holding accountable college campuses, colleges and K-12 schools who violate Jewish and other students' rights. So you can't have it both ways. If you care about countering anti-Semitism, you need to counter it in all forms, in your own party, by rejecting invasion and replacement rhetoric and other conspiracy theories and tropes, and by supporting the policies like funding the Office of Civil Rights, and by also ensuring that, yes, we are staying focused on campus anti-Semitism and the other ways it's manifesting in a post-October 7th world, but you have to do both. You can't just do one and have it both ways and claim that you are fighting anti-Semitism. So too, right, do I, as a progressive, need to call out anti-Semitism when it exists in progressive spaces and work in progressive spaces to counter it, whether it's in civil rights or labor or political or other spaces to do so. But we can't have it both ways, and we need the elected officials who claim to care about Jewish safety on campus actually care about Jewish safety everywhere.
That's super helpful. I will see you event next week. People ask that for the links. So we have 3 more minutes, and I would want to finalize by asking what do you think would be the best way to address the situation? How organization in the Jewish organization in America needs to address the democracy crisis in Israel? Is it something the same way we're fighting here for democracy? We should assume that democracy is non-partisan also when you deal with Israel? Or do you think that post October 7, when there is so many things going on the streets and on media, and people doesn't understand the delicate difference between supporting Israel and protesting the policies of Israel, being pro-Israeli, that we should reduce our volume and talk less about the dirty laundry back in Israel?
No, I think we need to be doing everything right now, right? We need to, here in the United States, we need to be fighting for democracy and countering anti-Semitism and all forms of hate, and ensuring that our allies and our partners and our government and our leaders can hold the complexity of all of this as it relates to Israel and Gaza, as we've been talking about, and the humanity of it all. And so too, does that apply when we engage in what's happening in Israel and taking our cues from Israelis who are out on the streets every weekend, showing that you can be deeply patriotic and pro-Israel and Zionist, and also criticize your government when you disagree with them. And it's so important that we help people understand that complexity. Because I think, frankly, what I've seen on the streets of Israel before October 7th and after October 7th is among some of the best arguments we have against the most extreme voices in the Israel conversation on the far left, who are saying that, you know, that all Israelis are supportive of every action of the IDF, of everything Bibi is doing. When in fact, Israel, like any democracy, obviously is having its own robust debate right now. And there are very clear, loud, pro-Israel Zionist voices in Israel who have also rejected the government and its actions and are demanding a deal or new leadership or an election. And so how as American Jews, we can help people understand that complexity is actually really helpful to a lot of the work that we and others are doing to engage people in the conversation around Israel and help them see that it's not quite as black and white as some of the loudest voices make it, and that there's a lot of gray area there that simply by engaging with the real people on the ground, the Israelis, the Palestinians, and others who are living this reality, they can see more clearly than if, you know, you turn on the Fox News or cable news soundbite or scroll through Twitter. And so I think it's really helping people understand that complexity and what is happening on the ground in Israel and frankly, in Gaza and the West Bank as well.
Yeah, I mean, and we are trying to say, occasionally trying to say that we are not our government.
Those of us who,
and that would be, again,
in America, we understand that deeply. Like, I think many of the progressives who lived through the Trump years would say the same thing.
Amy, thank you so much for being with us today, and I'm looking forward to see you next week in person in Bay Area, and also I think you are also stopping in LA, right?
Yes, Monday night in LA. There's a link. There's an event that we're doing with HIAS and the Holocaust Museum. It's in the chat on anti-Semitism and democracy and the Great Replacement Theory in particular, given the intersection with immigration. And then on Thursday in Los Altos Hills, I'll be in the Bay Area. And that event is also there as a public event, those 2 events. You can please feel free to share those with your friends and neighbors, and would love to see any of you there, and registration is required. So please make sure you do that.
And for all of you around the country, I mean, we're expecting a lot of visits from Israeli ministers and MKs before the high holidays here. So send us information about events if you have ones, and join us and follow us. There's going to be a lot of activity. It's been a year since Netanyahu has been to the UN, which means it's coming soon again. And yeah, we have a lot of fights to work for saving democracy both here and in Israel. So Amy, thank you again, and thank you everyone for joining, and I'll send the recording.
Thank you
Shabbat
so
shalom,
much.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Shabbat shalom.